In February 1998, the city of Huntsville, Texas, witnessed an execution that captured the world's attention like few others. Karla Faye Tucker, a 38-year-old woman who once shocked America with a brutal double murder, was about to become the first woman executed in Texas since the Civil War. Back in June 1983, Tucker and her boyfriend broke into the Houston apartment of Jerry Dean, a local mechanic. What began as a burglary spiraled into a night of unimaginable violence. Armed with a pickaxe, Tucker struck Dean repeatedly, killing him in cold blood. But didn't end there. Deborah Thornton, a 32-year-old mother who had been at Dean's home that night, was also attacked. She fought for her life, but the couple showed no mercy. When it was over, two innocent people lay dead, their lives stolen in the most savage way possible. The murders were shocking enough, but what horrified the nation even more was Tucker's chilling confession. She admitted that as she drove the pickaxe into her victims, she felt a sense of pleasure, even claiming she experienced an orgasm during the killings. Those words would follow her for the rest of her life. But in the years that followed, something unexpected happened. Behind bars, Karla Fay Tucker claimed she had found God. She became a born-again Christian, soft-spoken, remorseful, and transformed, at least in the eyes of her supporters. Soon, her story was no longer just about murder, but about redemption, forgiveness, and the ultimate question: can a person truly change? As the execution date approached, religious leaders, politicians, and even the Pope begged for mercy. But Texas would not bend. On February 3rd, 1998, after a final meal of a banana, a peach, and a garden salad, Karla was strapped to the gurney. When asked for her last words, she looked toward the families of her victims and said, "I am so sorry. I hope God will give you peace." 7 minutes later, she was gone. To understand how a young woman's violent past led her to death row, how her story sparked an international debate on faith and justice, and why her final words still echo decades later, we have to go back to the beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this is a case that doesn't just test the law, it tests the human heart. Born on November 18th, 1959, in Houston, Texas, Karla Fay Tucker grew up in an environment shaped by instability and fractured family dynamics. As her father left when she was still a child, and her mother, who was often drawn into the rough biker culture of the time, exposed young Karla to late nights, hard living, and influences well beyond her years. So by the time she was just 12, she had already begun experimenting with drugs. By 14, she had fallen into risky and dangerous behaviors that placed her on the margins of society. And by 16, she had entered into a brief and turbulent marriage that quickly ended in divorce, leaving her with no guidance, no structure, and no real sense of security. And as the 1970s wore on, she became increasingly immersed in Houston's biker subculture, where heavy drug use, alcohol, and violence were common, all of which shaped her into a troubled young woman whose early years were defined not by safety or stability, but by chaos, excess, and the absence of direction that would eventually lead her down a dark and destructive path. Jerry Lynn Dean, 27 years old at the time, was a Houston mechanic who had grown up working with his hands and living a rough, hard-edged lifestyle that often brought him into conflict with those around him. Yet despite his struggles, he was beginning to look for stability and a chance to put his life in order, and on the night of June 13th, 1983, he was at his modest apartment, surrounded by the motorcycle parts he loved to collect, unaware that this ordinary evening would be his last. While across town, 32-year-old Deborah Thornton, a devoted wife and mother of 2 young children, had decided to attend a neighborhood party where she spent the evening socializing and enjoying herself. But when the gathering wound down and she chose to accompany a friend back to Jerry Dean's place, she had no way of knowing that her decision would place her directly in the path of unimaginable violence. And within hours, her family's world would be shattered, as the lives of Jerry Dean and Deborah Thornton, 2 people with very different stories, one a mechanic seeking order and the other a mother raising her children, would collide in a tragedy that robbed both of their futures and left behind grieving families who would never be the same again. On the night of June 13th, 1983, fueled by drugs and desperation. 23-year-old Karla Faye Tucker and her boyfriend Danny Garrett broke into the modest Houston apartment of Jerry Dean with the intention of stealing motorcycle parts. But when Dean awoke to the noise and confronted them, a heated argument quickly escalated into violence. And in the chaos, Karla grabbed hold of the heavy pickaxe she found inside the apartment and swung it repeatedly at Dean until his body gave way to the force of her attack, ending his life in a brutal and frenzied moment. And as this was unfolding, Deborah Thornton, who had come to Dean's apartment after leaving a party, found herself trapped in the middle of the nightmare, desperately trying to escape, but ultimately cornered by the pair. And despite her pleas for mercy, she too was struck down, suffering a violent death at the hands of Karla and Danny, leaving the apartment soaked in the evidence of a double murder that stunned investigators. When they arrived, and in the days that followed, when Karla was arrested and later questioned, she not only admitted to the killings but made a chilling confession that during the attack she felt a disturbing rush of excitement. A statement so shocking that even hardened law enforcement officers and courtroom observers were left shaken. And it was this gruesome detail, combined with the savagery of the crime, that ensured her name would be etched into the annals of Texas criminal history. With the crime scene leaving little doubt about what had happened, and with Karla Faye Tucker herself offering a chilling confession that detailed her role in the killings, investigators quickly gathered overwhelming evidence against her and her boyfriend Danny Garrett, leading to their arrest and eventual trial in Houston, where in April of 1984 Karla sat before a jury as prosecutors laid out the gruesome details of the murders, presenting photographs, forensic reports, and eyewitness testimony that painted a vivid picture of two lives cut short. While the defense could offer little to counter the brutality of her own admissions, and as jurors listened to her describe the events of that night, including the disturbing way she claimed to have felt during the attack, any chance of sympathy was eclipsed by the horror of the crime itself, resulting in her conviction for capital murder and a sentence of death by lethal injection, a punishment that would make her one of the very few women on Texas's death row at the time. While her accomplice Danny Garrett, equally complicit in the murders, was also sentenced to die, though he never faced the execution chamber himself, as he would later succumb to natural causes while awaiting his fate, leaving Karla as the central figure in a case that was already becoming one of the most infamous in Texas history. Once confined to the walls of death row, Karla Faye Tucker began a transformation that few could have predicted, as the brash and defiant young woman who had once shocked the nation with her confessions of violence slowly gave way to a soft-spoken figure who embraced Christianity with fervent devotion, declaring herself a born-again believer and immersing herself in daily prayer, Bible study, and counseling sessions with fellow inmates, where she spoke openly about remorse, redemption, and the hope of spiritual salvation. And over the years, her demeanor changed so profoundly that journalists, prison staff, and even religious leaders who encountered her described a woman who seemed almost unrecognizable from the reckless figure who had committed the murders, a change that resonated far beyond the prison walls as evangelical leaders, pastors, and ordinary citizens began to rally behind her cause, with many arguing that her life should be spared because she represented the possibility of true rehabilitation. And by the mid-1990s, Karla was no longer widely portrayed as a remorseless killer, but rather as a living example of forgiveness and transformation, a polarizing symbol whose story forced the public to question whether the death penalty should apply to someone who appeared to have genuinely changed. As the scheduled date of Karla Faye Tucker's execution drew closer, her case exploded onto the national and international stage, sparking a global debate unlike anything Texas had seen in years, with supporters flooding the governor's office and courts with petitions, letters, and appeals that argued she was no longer the same person who had committed the murders, pointing to her deep faith, her gentle demeanor, and her tireless work ministering to others as proof that she had been spiritually redeemed. While religious leaders who had long supported the death penalty, including televangelists Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell, shocked their own followers by pleading for her life. And even Pope John Paul II joined the call for mercy, asking that her sentence be commuted to life in prison, Yet for every voice of compassion, there were those who reminded the public that behind her transformation were two victims, Jerry Dean and Deborah Thornton, whose lives had been cut short in a brutal and senseless manner. And their families and supporters argued that forgiveness and faith did not erase accountability, insisting that the law had spoken and justice must be carried out. So when the final decision reached the desk of Texas Governor George W. Bush, he weighed both the public pressure and the consistent rulings of the courts before announcing that despite her transformation and the international pleas for clemency, the sentence would stand, a decision that cemented the execution and set the stage for one of the most controversial final chapters in American death penalty history. On the evening of February 3, 1998, after nearly 15 years on death row and countless appeals that had drawn the eyes of the world, Karla Faye Tucker awoke to her final day inside the Huntsville unit in Texas, where she spent her last hours in prayer and quiet reflection before being offered a simple last meal of a banana, a peach, and a garden salad, a choice that stood in stark contrast to the elaborate requests of others who had come before her. And as the sun set over the prison walls, candlelight vigils were held outside by both supporters pleading for mercy and protesters demanding justice. While inside, at precisely 6:45 p.m., Karla was escorted into the starkly lit execution chamber, calmly strapped to the gurney, and given the chance to speak her last words, at which point she turned her head toward the families of Jerry Dean and Deborah Thornton and in a steady voice said, "I am so sorry. I hope God will give you peace," before continuing with a declaration of love for her own family and a final expression of her faith in Jesus Christ, words that carried both remorse and serenity as the lethal injection was administered. And within minutes the drugs coursed through her veins, slowing her breathing until, just 7 minutes later, she was pronounced dead, leaving behind a moment that was at once historic, controversial, and deeply emotional for everyone who had followed her case from the beginning. The execution of Karla Faye Tucker was more than the end of a criminal case. It was a cultural moment that reverberated far beyond the walls of the Huntsville unit. For while some saw it as proof that redemption, faith, and personal transformation, no matter how sincere, could never erase the responsibility for taking innocent lives, others viewed it as a sobering example of the flaws in a justice system that was unable or unwilling to weigh the reality of change against the rigid finality of capital punishment. And so Karla became a polarizing figure, condemned by many as a brutal killer who had confessed to unthinkable acts, yet embraced by others as a symbol of forgiveness, spiritual renewal, and the belief that no person is beyond redemption, leaving her legacy to rest not only in the violent tragedy of Jerry Dean and Deborah Thornton's deaths, but also in the debates her case reignited about morality, faith, justice, and mercy, debates that continue to echo through American society. And as the images of Dean, Thornton, and Tucker fade together into memory, her story forces us to confront one haunting question. Can a person truly change? And if they can, should it matter when the law demands death? And with that, we come to the end of the story of Karla Faye Tucker, a tale of violence, faith, justice, and redemption that continues to stir debate decades later. What do you think? Should redemption change the course of justice? Or does the law demand that some debts can only be paid with the ultimate price? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if you found it powerful, share it with others who follow true crime stories, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another episode here on the True Crime Report Network.